The first time a monitor picked up the sound, it wasn't a cry. It was a rhythmic, metallic clicking, the sound of a typewriter being operated underwater. My wife, Sarah, and I had moved into the house on Miller's Lane in late 2025, just 3 months after our son, Leo, was born. It was an old Victorian, restored with just enough modern amenities to hide its age, but the bones of the place still groaned under the weight of a century of winters. We were exhausted, living in that hazy, blue-tinted world of sleep deprivation where every shadow looks like a person and every creak sounds like a footstep. To save a bit of money, I'd picked up a vintage Baby-Safe 2000 radio monitor from a local estate sale. It was a bulky, cream-colored plastic unit with a long, telescoping antenna and a glowing green power light that flickered like a dying firefly. The seller, an old man whose hand shook as he wrapped the cord, told me it had exceptional range. He wasn't lying. On a Tuesday night, around 2:14 a.m., the receiver on my nightstand hissed to life. I sat up, blinking against the dark. Sarah was out cold, her breathing deep and rhythmic. I reached for the monitor, expecting to hear Leo's soft grunts or the rustle of his swaddle. Instead, I heard the clicking. Click-clack, click-clack, click-clack. It was too steady to be accidental. Between the clicks, there was a low-frequency hum, a sound so deep it made the water in the glass on my nightstand vibrate in tiny, concentric circles. I turned the volume knob to its maximum. The static flared, a jagged wall of white noise, and then a voice broke through. It didn't sound like a human throat had produced it. It sounded like a collection of radio signals being stitched together in real time, the syllables varying in pitch and distortion. Entry 001, the voice whispered. It was a flat, clinical tone, devoid of gender or emotion. The anchor is placed. The soft tissue is receptive. The frequency is tuned to the marrow of the third generation. My blood turned to ice. I looked at the green light on the monitor. It was no longer flickering. It was pulsing in time with the hum. "Sarah," I whispered, shaking her shoulder. "Sarah, wake up." She groaned, pushing her hair back. "Is he awake?" "Listen," I said, holding the monitor between us. The clicking had stopped. Now, there was a new sound, the sound of a heavy door being dragged across a stone floor. Grind, scrape, grind. "What is that?" Sarah's voice was sharp with instant mother adrenaline. "Is someone in the nursery?" "I don't know," I said, already reaching for the flashlight. We bolted down the hallway. Our floorboards, usually loud enough to wake the dead, felt oddly soft under our feet, spongy, as if the wood had turned to wet moss overnight. The air in the corridor was thick with the scent of ozone and something sweet and sickly, like rotting lilies. I threw open the nursery door. The room was bathed in the pale, blue light of the moon. Leo was fast asleep in his crib, his small chest rising and falling in perfect silence. The window was locked. The closet was empty. Everything was exactly as it should have been, except for the baby-safe transmitter sitting on the changing table. The long antenna was bent at a 90-degree angle, pointing directly at Leo's head. The plastic casing of the unit was glowing with a faint, bioluminescent heat, and a thin trail of yellowish smoke was curling out of the speaker mesh. Entry 002, a voice hissed. This time, it didn't come from the receiver in the bedroom. It came directly from the transmitter in the room. It was my own voice, or rather, a perfect digital facsimile of it. The subject remains unaware of a laugh, the voice said, using my exact inflections. He thinks the walls are solid. He doesn't know that the frequency has already thinned the plaster. The child is no longer behind the wood. The child is behind the glass. I lunged for the transmitter, intending to rip the cord from the wall. But as my fingers brushed the plastic, a jolt of static electricity threw me backward. My arm went numb. a swarm of invisible needles pricking my skin from the elbow to the fingertips. "Mark!" Sarah screamed. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the crib. I scrambled up, my heart hammering against my ribs. In the pale moonlight, I saw it. Leo was still lying there, but his reflection in the glass of the framed alphabet poster on the wall was different. In the reflection, the crib was empty, and standing over the empty crib was a figure. It was impossibly tall, its limbs thin and multi-jointed like the legs of a harvestman spider. It wore a tattered, dark coat that seemed to absorb the light around it. It had no face, only a smooth, wood-like surface where eyes and a mouth should have been. The figure in the glass leaned down, its long, pale fingers hovering just millimeters above where Leo's sleeping head was in the real world. Entry 003. The monitor rattled, the voice now shifting into a distorted version of Sarah's voice. "The threshold is vibrating. The silver is wet. Tell the archivist to stop the recording, or the marrow will turn to salt." Suddenly, the green light on the transmitter turned a violent, pulsing red. The alphabet poster on the wall cracked. A long, jagged fissure split the letter down the middle, and a drop of thick, black fluid, like liquid static, began to leak from the glass, dripping onto the nursery floor. The hum in the room intensified, becoming a physical weight that pressed us toward the ground. "Get him!" I choked out, grabbing Sarah's hand. We lunged for the crib, but as we reached into the slats, our hands didn't hit the soft cotton of the mattress. We hit something cold, hard, and vibrating. It felt like we were reaching into a television screen. Leo's body flickered. For a split second, he turned into a jagged mess of black and white pixels, his cries sounding like a burst of radio interference. And then, he was solid again, but the room around us was changing. The wallpaper was peeling back in long, wet strips, revealing not the wooden lath of the house, but a dense network of pulsing gray roots. The ceiling began to drip with that same yellowish sap, and the scent of the forest, old, damp, and predatory, filled the air. "The frequency is locked," the transmitter shrieked, the voice now a chorus of 1,000 whispers. "Welcome to the broadcast, Mark. The first part is over. The recording is permanent." The nursery door slammed shut, and the bolt clicked into place from the outside. But we were the only ones in the house. The sound of the nursery door slamming shut wasn't the heavy thud of wood against wood. It was the sharp, metallic snap of a circuit breaker closing. I lunged for the handle, my fingers slipping on the brass knob. It was freezing, so cold that the moisture from my palm turned to a thin sheet of white frost instantly. I pulled with everything I had, but the door didn't just feel locked. It felt as though it had become part of the wall itself, the seams between the frame and the plaster vanishing beneath a growing layer of that thick, gray root tissue. "Mark, look at the monitor." Sarah's voice was high, hovering on the edge of a total breakdown. I turned around. The BabySafe 2000 transmitter on the changing table was no longer smoking. The red light had stabilized into a steady, angry glow that cast long, needle-like shadows across the room. But the speaker wasn't emitting static anymore. It was playing back a recording of us. "Is someone in the nursery?" Sarah's voice from 5 minutes ago echoed through the small plastic speaker. "I don't know," my own recorded voice replied. But then, the recording diverged. "The child is behind the glass," the monitor said, but it wasn't a recording of anything I had said. It was a new layer, stitched into the audio of our past conversation. "The marrow is the antenna. The salt is the ground. Silas, the boy is looking at the frequency." "Who is Silas?" Sarah whispered, clutching Leo to her chest. The baby had finally woken up, but he wasn't crying. He was staring, wide-eyed and silent, at the alphabet poster on the wall. I didn't answer. The name Silas hit me like a physical blow. Silas Vance was my grandfather, a man who had died in a psychiatric ward in 1998, screaming about the silver in the soil and the tall man who records the trees. My family had always told me he was a victim of early onset dementia, a man lost in a world of ghosts and radio static. I looked at the alphabet poster. The crack in the glass had widened. The black fluid, that liquid static, was no longer dripping. It was flowing, pooling on the floorboards in a perfect obsidian circle. Entry 004, the monitor hissed. The voice was now a perfect clinical imitation of my grandfather's dry, gravelly tone. The subject has recognized the lineage. The signal is reaching back through the marrow. He thinks the house is on Miller's Lane, but he doesn't know that the house is built on the 1986 broadcast. The room began to tilt. It wasn't the floor moving. It was the reality within the room warping. The blue moonlight coming through the window turned a sickly, oxidized green. The shadows of the crib slats on the floor began to move independently of the light, stretching out like long, multi-jointed fingers. "We have to get out through the window," I said, my voice sounding hollow, as if I were speaking into a deep well. I grabbed a heavy wooden block from Leo's toy chest and threw it at the window pane. Thud! The block didn't shatter the glass. It bounced off with a soft, wet sound, as if I had thrown it against a sheet of raw meat. The window wasn't glass anymore. It was a thick, translucent membrane, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic beat that matched the hum of the baby monitor. Through the membrane, the backyard was gone. There were no trees, no fences, no neighbors' lights. There was only a dense, endless thicket of gray, leafless poles that looked like a forest of dead radio towers, stretching into a sky of pure, unmoving white static. Entry 005, the voice boomed. This time it came from the walls, the ceiling, and the floor simultaneously. The archivist is testing the perimeter. He finds the laugh is soft. He finds the lens is closed. To open the circuit, he must offer the first record. "Give me the baby," I whispered, reaching for Leo. "No." Sarah pulled back, her eyes wild. "Mark, look at his eyes." I looked. Leo's pupils weren't round anymore. They had flattened into horizontal slits, glowing with a faint, greenish luminescence. The exact same color as the power light on the vintage monitor. He looked at me, and for a second, I didn't see my son. I saw a receiver, a vessel. "The frequency is in his bones, Sarah," I said, the realization chilling me to the core. He's not just hearing it, he's broadcasting it. Suddenly, the alphabet poster exploded. The glass didn't fly outward. It was sucked inward into the black void behind the frame. A massive, pale limb, 9 feet long and covered in a fine, dark fuzz like mold on a damp branch, shot out from the darkness. It didn't have a hand. It ended in a series of long, needle-like sensors that vibrated with a high-pitched, metallic shriek. The limb lunged for the baby monitor. I swung the wooden toy chest lid, catching the limb midair. The impact felt like hitting a solid iron pipe wrapped in wet leather. The creature, the tall one from my grandfather's stories, let out a sound that wasn't a scream. It was a burst of high-decibel white noise that blew out the light bulb in the ceiling and sent us collapsing to our knees. In the sudden, absolute darkness, the only thing visible was the red light of the monitor. Entry 006, the voice whispered, sounding incredibly close now, right behind my ear. "The tracking is misaligned. The subject is resisting the transmission, but the marrow is already tuned. If the father doesn't turn the dial, the mother will become the ground." I felt a cold, wet pressure against my ankle. I looked down. The gray roots from the walls were no longer just peeling back the wallpaper. They were wrapping around Sarah's legs, their pale fibers sinking into her skin like leeches. "Mark," she gasped, her voice thinning as if she were being pulled away by a distant radio signal. "Help me." I lunged for the baby monitor. If this was the source, I had to destroy it. I grabbed the cream-colored plastic unit, ignoring the searing static shock that charred my fingertips. "You want a record?" I screamed into the speaker. "Here's your record." I raised the monitor over my head to smash it against the changing table. But as I did, the speaker let out a sound that stopped my heart. It was Leo's voice. Not the baby we held now, but Leo's voice as a grown man. Deep, resonant, and filled with a profound, soul-crushing grief. "Don't break it, Dad," the voice from the future pleaded. "If you break the circuit now, we'll be stuck in the static forever. The forest is the only thing keeping the white sky from falling." My hands trembled. The red light of the monitor reflected in the greenish glow of my son's eyes. "Entry 007, the voice whispered, and this time, it was my own voice from the moment I was born. "The archivist hesitates. The silver is warming up. The broadcast is about to go live." The floor beneath us gave way with a sound like a thunderclap, and we began to fall. Not into the living room below, but into a yawning, pitch-black pit that smelled of ozone, ancient pines, and wet, magnetic tape. The fall didn't end with an impact. Instead of the bone-shattering crash against the joists of the first floor, we hit a dense, viscous layer of what felt like liquid wool. It was a sea of black magnetic dust, millions of tiny, magnetized particles that suspended us in a freezing, lightless void. I coughed, the metallic grit coating my tongue and throat. Beside me, Sarah was gasping, her silhouette barely visible in the faint, rhythmic red pulsing of the baby monitor, which I was still clutching like a holy relic. Leo was silent, his small body tucked against Sarah's chest, his glowing green eyes the only steady lights in the dark. "Mark!" Sarah's voice was a ragged whisper, muffled as if she were speaking through a thick curtain. "Where are we? Where's the house?" "We're in the source," I said, the words tasting like copper. I held up the baby monitor. The red light wasn't just a LED anymore. It was a beam cutting through the black dust to reveal the geometry of the space we were in. We weren't in a basement. We were inside a massive, subterranean cylinder made of millions of miles of unspooled cassette tape. The walls were shimmering ribbons of dark plastic, winding upward into an infinite height where the faint, greenish glow of the nursery ceiling still flickered like a distant star. "Entry 008, the monitor rattled. The voice was no longer mimicking my family. It had become a fractured, multi-layered storm of thousands of voices, men, women, and children, all speaking in perfect, terrifying unison. The subjects have entered the well of the unrecorded. The frequency has reached the substrata. The father holds the dial. The mother holds the anchor. The child holds the future signal. "We need to find a way out," Sarah said, her voice rising in panic. "The dust, it's getting into his lungs, Mark. Look." A thin, black line of magnetic dust was snaking its way toward Leo's nostrils, drawn by the strange, bioluminescent heat radiating from his skin. I looked at the monitor in my hand. The cream-colored plastic was warping, the BabySafe 2000 logo bubbling and peeling away to reveal a different name etched into the metal beneath. Advanced Signal Recovery Unit. My grandfather hadn't just bought this thing. He had built it, or he had been forced to help something else build it. Entry 009. The chorus boomed from the ribbon walls. The archivist begins to see the laugh. To save the anchor, he must tune the device to the year of the burn. He must find a frequency of 1986. 1986, I muttered. The year my grandfather disappeared for 3 months. The year the village near the creek was wiped off the maps. I looked at the volume and tuning knobs on the monitor. They were no longer simple plastic dials. They were carved from a dark, heavy bone, stained with the same yellowish sap I had seen in the nursery. I reached for the tuning dial. The moment my fingers touched the bone, the ribbons of tape around us began to spin. Whir. The sound was deafening. The collective scream of a billion recorded memories being played backward at high speed. Images began to flicker on the walls of the well. Distorted, grainy glimpses of a forest fire, a man in a white lab coat screaming into a microphone, and a 9-foot-tall figure standing in the center of a burning nursery. "Mark, stop it!" Sarah cried, shielding Leo's face. "It's burning him." Leo was glowing brighter now, his skin becoming translucent, showing a network of glowing green veins that looked like circuit traces beneath his flesh. "I have to find a frequency," I shouted over the roar of the tape. "If I don't lock the signal, we'll be erased." I turned the bone dial, my fingers blistering from the sudden, intense heat of the unit. The red light shifted to an orange flicker, then a deep, bruised purple. Click! The spinning tape walls stopped instantly. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt like it was pressing the air out of my chest. In front of us, the ribbons of tape parted like a curtain, revealing a small, perfectly preserved room. It was my grandfather's study from the old house, exactly as it had looked in 1986. Silas Vance was sitting at his desk, his back to us, hunched over a massive reel-to-reel tape recorder. "Grandfather?" I whispered. The man at the desk didn't turn, but the voice that came from the baby monitor was his, clear, calm, and utterly hopeless. "Entry 010, the voice said. "The grandson has found the well. He thinks he's here to rescue the child, but he doesn't know that the child is the only thing keeping the forest from breathing. Mark, don't look at the reel. Don't look at what I'm recording." Slowly, the Silas at the desk began to turn. But it wasn't my grandfather. His head was a massive, rotating reel of magnetic tape, the dark ribbon feeding directly into his neck through a series of surgical steel pins. His eyes were two glowing green vacuum tubes, and his mouth was a speaker mesh filled with wet, gray moss. He raised a long, spindly hand, a hand that had too many joints, and pointed at the monitor in my grip. "The frequency is open, Mark," the creature said, its voice a perfect mechanical duplicate of my own. "Give me the receiver. Give me the boy. The broadcast must be completed." From the shadows behind the desk, the tall one emerged, its faceless head scraping against the ceiling of the tape well. It didn't lunge. It simply waited, its needle-like fingers vibrating with the sound of 1,000 dead radio stations. "Sarah, run," I whispered, stepping between her and the desk. "Where?" she sobbed. "There's nowhere to go." "Into the static," I said, pointing the baby monitor at the floor. "We have to jump into the unrecorded." I turned the dial to the very end, to the off position. But instead of clicking, the knob kept spinning faster and faster until the red light turned into a blinding, white-hot beam of pure energy. "Entry 011. The chorus screamed, a sound of pure agony. "The archivist is breaking the loop. The signal is collapsing." The well of tape began to dissolve into white ash. The room from 1986 flickered and died like a blown bulb. We were falling again, but this time the air was cold, clean, and smelled of the winter we had left behind. But as we fell, I felt a sharp, burning pain in my chest. I looked down. A long, gray fiber, a root from the creature's hand, was hooked into the plastic casing of the monitor, and through the monitor, it was hooked into my own heart. "You're not leaving the broadcast, Mark," the voice whispered in my skull. "You're just moving to a different channel." The sensation of falling didn't stop, but the environment shifted. The vertical tunnel of magnetic tape didn't lead us back to the nursery on Miller's Lane. Instead, we slammed into a hard, uneven surface that smelled of wet iron and ancient, stagnant water. I gasped, the impact vibrating through my teeth. The baby monitor was still fused in my hand, the red light now a dim, sickly violet. The gray fiber, the root that had hooked into my chest, was pulsing, pulling a cold, electric current directly out of my heartbeat. Every time my heart thudded, the violet light on the monitor flared. "Sarah," I croaked, pushing myself up. She was 10 feet away, curled around Leo on a floor of rusted metal grates. We weren't in a house. We were in a massive, industrial void, a forest of gargantuan radio towers that stretched upward into a sky made of rolling, white television static. The air was freezing, and the wind didn't howl. It hissed, carrying the fractured voices of 1,000 dead broadcasts. "I'm here," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Mark, look at the sky. There's no sun. There's nothing." I looked up. The white sky my grandfather had feared wasn't a metaphor. It was a literal ceiling of glowing, frantic interference. It felt like we were standing on the surface of a giant, dying vacuum tube. Entry 012, the monitor rattled in my hand. The voice was closer now, vibrating not from the speaker, but from the gray root buried in my chest. "The subjects have reached the transmitter. The archivist is now the battery. The mother is the shield. The child is the broadcast tower. To ground the signal, the battery must be drained. Mark, your chest." Sarah crawled toward me, her eyes wide with horror. I looked down. The gray fiber wasn't just hooked into me, it was growing. Fine, translucent capillaries were spreading from the point of impact, webbing across my skin like a circuit board. My veins were beginning to glow with that same violet light. "It's using me, Sarah," I said, my voice sounding metallic even to my own ears. "It's using my pulse to power the transmission." Suddenly, the rusted floor beneath us began to vibrate. Thump, thump, thump. From the forest of radio towers, a figure emerged. It was the tall one, but here, in its own domain, it wasn't a shadow. It was a terrifying construct of bone, copper wire, and wet, gray wood. Its limbs were mismatched. One arm a jagged branch of ancient pine, the other a long, multi-jointed antenna that sparked with blue electricity. Its faceless head was a smooth, porcelain mask with a single, rotating glass lens in the center. The lens fixed on Leo. Entry 013. The creature boomed, the sound coming from the sky itself. The marrow is ripe. The 3 generations of Vance are aligned. Silas the recording, Mark the power, and Leo the signal. The broadcast to the white sky begins now. Leo began to float. He didn't scream. He didn't even move. His small body rose into the freezing air, his skin becoming so bright with green luminescence that I had to shield my eyes. The forest of radio towers began to hum in sympathy, the sound growing into a bone-shattering scream of feedback. "No!" Sarah lunged for him, but the creature's antenna arms swept out, a bolt of static throwing her back against the rusted grates. "Sarah!" I tried to move, but the root in my chest yanked me back. I was tethered to the floor, a living capacitor for a nightmare machine. Entry 014, the monitor hissed, the voice now sounding like my grandfather's dying breath. The child sees the forest. He sees the 1986 morning. He sees the fire that never went out. "Mark, look at the monitor. Look at the dial." I looked down at the Baby Safe 2000. The bone-carved dial was spinning on its own, but there was a new setting etched into the plastic, glowing in a color I couldn't name. It wasn't a number. It was a symbol, a circle with a line through it. The mute. The mute, I whispered. Silas didn't want to record the signal. He wanted to silence it. I reached for the dial, but the gray root in my chest surged with power, paralyzing my arm. The tall one turned its porcelain face toward me, the glass lens whirring as it zoomed in on the monitor. The mute is an empty record. The creature spoke, its voice a cacophony of every person I had ever loved. Empty records are for the dead. We are the recording. We are forever. The creature began to walk toward me, its heavy, wooden feet clanging against the metal. With every step, the root in my chest pulled tighter, drawing more of my life, my memories, my very self into the violet light. I saw flashes of my childhood, my first bike, the scent of Sarah's hair, the day Leo was born, all of them being stripped away, turned into raw data to be broadcast into the static sky. "Mark, fight it!" Sarah screamed, struggling to get up. I looked at her, and for a second, I couldn't remember her name. The recording was erasing me. I looked at Leo, floating in the center of the towers, a tiny, glowing beacon in a world of ghosts. If the broadcast started, he wouldn't be my son anymore. He would be the voice of the tall one forever. I used the only thing I had left. I didn't try to pull the root out. I leaned into it. Entry 015. I whispered, my own voice overlapping with the monitors. The battery is overloading. The archivist is changing the frequency. I grabbed the gray root with both hands, ignoring the agonizing electrical discharge. I didn't pull away, I pushed. I forced every memory I had, every ounce of my love for Sarah and Leo, not into the recording, but directly into the root itself. I flooded the circuit with more power than it could handle. The violet light turned white. The tall one froze, its porcelain mask cracking. The forest of radio towers began to glow with a blinding, overloaded heat. "What are you doing?" the creature shrieked, its voice fracturing into 1,000 pieces of static. "I'm muting the house," I said. I grabbed the bone dial and twisted it toward the symbol. Krayak. The baby monitor shattered in my hand. The gray root in my chest exploded into a cloud of white ash. The world didn't go dark, it went silent. A silence so profound it felt like the universe had held its breath. Leo fell from the air, and I caught him just before we were swallowed by a sudden, violent surge of white static that tore the metal floor from beneath our feet. The silence was worse than the noise. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of a sleeping house. It was the heavy, pressurized silence of a vacuum. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in the nursery, and I wasn't in the forest of towers. I was lying on a bed of cold, gray ash that stretched as far as the eye could see. The sky above was no longer white static. It was a bruised, motionless purple, like a fading screen. I looked down at my chest. The skin where the root had been was scarred with a pattern of white, branching lines, a permanent map of the circuit that had nearly drained my life. The baby monitor was gone, reduced to a handful of melted cream-colored plastic and a single, charred bone dial that I still held in my fist. "Sarah," I called out. My voice didn't travel. It fell flat to the ground, muffled by the ash. "Mark, over here." I scrambled toward the sound. Sarah was sitting a few yards away, cradling Leo. They both looked like ghosts, their clothes and hair covered in a fine layer of the gray dust. Leo's eyes were no longer glowing green, but they weren't normal either. They were a flat, matte black, reflecting nothing. "He's not breathing right," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with terror. "It's like his lungs are full of static." Every time Leo exhaled, a small cloud of that same gray ash escaped his lips. Entry 016, a voice muttered. It didn't come from a monitor. It came from the ash beneath my hands. The ground itself was speaking. "The mute has been engaged. The broadcast is paused, but the marrow cannot be emptied. To save the signal, the archivist must find the first station." The first station, I repeated, looking around the desolate landscape. In the distance, poking through the gray dunes, was the top of a familiar structure. It was the roof of the nursery on Miller's Lane, tilted at an impossible angle, half buried in the ash. "We have to go back in," I said, helping Sarah up. As we trudged through the ash toward the buried house, the ground began to ripple. It wasn't an earthquake, it was a rhythmic pulsing like a giant heart beating deep underground. With every pulse, the ash would jump, forming the shapes of people we knew, my parents, Silas, neighbors, who would dissipate into dust the moment we got close. "Entry 017, the ground whispered. "The recording is trying to reboot. The white sky is hungry for the marrow. The mute is only a temporary wall." We reached the nursery window, which was now level with the ash. I kicked in a membrane, which had turned brittle and glass-like, and we crawled inside. The room was unrecognizable. The wallpaper was gone, leaving only the bare lath, but the wood was now translucent, glowing with a faint, dying amber light. In the center of the room, where the crib had stood, was a massive, ancient television set, a console from the 1950s with a screen as large as a porthole. Sitting in front of the TV, his back to us, was a small child. "Lau!" Sarah gasped. The child turned. It wasn't Leo. It was a boy of about 6, wearing pajamas from another era. His face was a blurry mess of low-resolution pixels, but I knew the shape of that jaw. "Grandfather?" I whispered. "Mark," the pixelated boy said, his voice sounding like a distant AM radio station. "You shouldn't have muted it. The silence is where the tall one hides his hunger. He's not a recorder anymore. He's a rewriter." Behind the boy, the screen of the TV flickered to life. It didn't show a show. It showed us, standing in the room, looking at the boy. But in the TV, the tall one was standing directly behind me, its long needle fingers resting on my shoulders. I spun around. There was nothing there. Entry 018. The TV boomed, the voice now a violent, distorted roar. "The recording is being edited. The archivist is being deleted from the frame." Suddenly, I felt a horrific sensation. My left hand began to blur, the edges of my fingers turning into jagged, transparent pixels. I couldn't feel the bone dial anymore. I was being erased from the reality of the room. "Mark!" Sarah screamed, reaching for me, but her hand passed right through my arm as if I were made of smoke. "The first station is the memory, Mark," the pixelated boy shouted over the roar of the TV. "If you don't anchor yourself to the marrow, you'll become part of the static." I looked at Leo. He was staring at me with those flat black eyes. He reached out a small hand and touched the scarred pattern on my chest. The moment his skin touched the white branches, a surge of pure, agonizing memory flooded back into me. Not just my memories, Silas's memories. I saw the village in 1986. I saw the moment the sky turned white and the forest began to grow into the walls. I saw the deal Silas made to save his own son, my father, by offering himself as the recording. "I am the battery," I hissed through gritted teeth, my hand solidifying as I forced the memories into my flesh. And I refused to be drained. I grabbed the charred bone dial and jammed it into the side of the ancient TV set. Spark! The screen shattered, but instead of glass, a torrent of thick, black magnetic tape poured out, coiling around the room like snakes. The pixelated boy vanished, and the amber light in the walls turned a violent, screaming red. Entry 019. The chorus shrieked from the ceiling. "The edit has failed. The archivist is rewriting the script. The marrow is turning to fire." The house began to shake, the gray ash outside pouring in through the window like a flood. "We have to go to the cellar," I shouted, grabbing Sarah and Leo. "The marrow is in the frame. We have to burn the frame." But as we turned toward the door, The tall one finally stepped out of the shadows. It wasn't 9 feet tall anymore. It was the size of the room, its limbs woven into the very lath and plaster, its porcelain face now a jagged, weeping mess of broken glass and wet, gray wood. It leaned down, its single lens whirring, and spoke with Leo's voice. "Daddy, why did you stop the music?" The voice of the tall one, sounding exactly like my son's innocent, high-pitched query, shattered my resolve more effectively than any burst of static ever could. I froze, my hand still clutching the charred bone dial, while the house on Miller's Lane groaned around us, dissolving into the gray dunes of ash. Entry 020, the ground beneath us vibrated a deep tectonic rumble. The final record is being etched. The father looks at the mask and sees the son. The mask looks at the father and sees the circuit. To end the broadcast, the archivist must destroy the antenna. The creature's porcelain face, now a jagged landscape of cracked glass, leaned closer. I could see my own reflection in the shards. Not a man, but a flickering, low-resolution ghost of himself, his skin mapped with glowing white scars. "He's not Leo, Mark." Sarah's scream broke the trance. She was backed against the translucent lath wall, holding the real Leo so tightly that the boy's matte black eyes seemed to absorb the amber light of the room. "Look at what's behind the face." I looked. Beyond the weeping glass and the wet gray wood of the creature's neck, I didn't see bone or muscle. I saw a massive, rotating reel-to-reel assembly made of calcified human remains. The tape was a dark, glistening ribbon of what looked like optic nerves and memory fibers, feeding into the porcelain mask. The tall one wasn't an entity. It was a biological recorder, a gargantuan machine built to harvest the lives of those tuned to its frequency. Entry 021, the chorus boomed, its voices now overlapping into a single, agonizing frequency. The broadcast is at 99%. The white sky is descending. The marrow is the final key. I felt the pull again. The white, branching scars on my chest flared with a blinding violet light, and I felt my consciousness begin to unspool, my thoughts being dragged into the creature's rotating reel. I saw the day I met Sarah, the first time I held Leo, the smell of the nursery, all of it turning into data, into static. "No," I growled, my voice sounding like a grinding of stones. I didn't try to pull away this time. I lunged. I drove my shoulder into the creature's chest, my hands plunging into the wet, gray wood of its torso. The internal machinery, the rotating reels of nerves, screamed as my fingers jammed the gears. The electrical discharge was catastrophic, charring my sleeves and sending arcs of blue fire dancing across the room. "You want the marrow?" I screamed, my vision turning into a jagged mess of pixels. "Then take the whole frequency." I jammed the charred bone dial, the mute, directly into the center of the creature's porcelain face, pushing it through the glass and deep into the whirring lens. Shatter. The lens didn't just break, it imploded. The mute wasn't a silence. It was a vacuum, a command to erase every recording ever made on this frequency. The tall one let out a sound that was the opposite of noise. It was a roar of absolute nothingness that sucked the air out of the room. The gray ash outside began to spiral into the creature's face, a massive vortex of dust and static consuming the entity from the inside out. "Mark, the floor," Sarah cried. The house was collapsing into the vortex. The translucent lath was splintering, and the amber light was being snuffed out. Entry 022, the ground whispered one last time, sounding like a dying sigh. "The circuit is broken. The archivist has erased the tape. The forest returns to the soil. But remember, the static never truly goes away. It only waits for a new receiver." I felt a pair of small, warm hands grab my face. I looked up. It was Leo. His eyes were no longer matte black. They were clear, bright, and filled with tears. He was breathing real, shallow, terrified breaths. "Daddy," he whispered. I grabbed them both and threw ourselves toward the window, into the swirling ash as the nursery, the tall one, and the white sky collapsed into a single, microscopic point of light. 1 year later, we live in the desert now, far from the trees of Miller's Lane, far from the damp creek where Silas Vance lost his mind. There are no mirrors in our house. There are no radios, no televisions, and certainly no baby monitors. We live in a quiet, under a sun that is hot, yellow, and real. The scars on my chest have faded to thin, silver lines, but they still itch when a storm rolls in. Sarah is different. She jumps at the sound of the wind, and she never sleeps with the lights off. But it's Leo, the first watch the most. He is a happy, normal child. He plays in the sand, he laughs at the lizards, and he sleeps through the night. But sometimes when the house is perfectly still and the desert moon is high, I find him standing by the window. He doesn't look at the stars. He looks at the horizon, where the heat haze meets the dark. And if I stand very close to him, I can hear it. It's faint, so quiet it might just be the blood rushing in my ears, but it's there. A soft, rhythmic metallic clicking. Click-clack, click-clack. And then, just for a second, his eyes will catch the moonlight, and I see a flicker of that emerald green. "Entry 001, he whispers to the dark. The new anchor is placed. The broadcast is ready to begin again. Then he turns to me, smiles, and asks for a glass of water. And I give it to him, because in this world, we only record what we choose to remember.